One moment. Half a second. That is all it took. A lightsaber came down in a chancellor's office above the city of Coruscant, and the Jedi Order was finished. 3,000 years of history ended by a single motion, by one man, by half a second of decision that had been a lifetime in the making. The man who raised that blade was not a Sith, not an enemy, not a traitor in any ordinary sense of the word. He was the chosen one. His name was Anakin Skywalker, the most powerful Force-sensitive being alive, the hero with no fear, the man the entire Jedi Order had been built around for the last decade, the Golden Child, the one the ancient prophecy said would bring balance to the Force. And in the single most important moment of his generation, he raised his weapon not against the Sith Lord standing across the room. He raised it against Mace Windu, the Jedi Master who had finally cornered the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known, who had him beaten, who had him disarmed, who was seconds away from ending Palpatine, ending the Sith, ending the war, saving everything, seconds away from winning. Anakin stopped him. Why? Why would the Chosen One save the most powerful Sith who had ever lived? Why would the man destined to destroy the Sith stand in a doorway and choose the wrong side in the worst possible moment? What was happening inside him in those final seconds that made that choice feel like the only option he had? The answer is not what most people expect. It was not ambition. It was not the seduction of power. It was not even the dark side, at least not in the way that word is usually understood. It was love, and that is what makes this the most devastating story in the history of the galaxy. Not a villain's triumph, a man's love, a wound that had been bleeding since childhood, a promise he had made over his mother's grave, and a choice that arrived in half a second after 30 years of being quietly, carefully, patiently set up to make it. To understand why Anakin Skywalker made the choice he made on the night that changed the history of the galaxy, you cannot start with that night. You cannot start with the Jedi Council or the Chancellor's office or Mace Windu or even the dreams of Padme dying in a place he could not reach. All of that is the surface of something much older and much deeper. To understand the choice, you have to understand the person making it. And to understand the person, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of his career, not the beginning of the war, the real beginning, the one that happened in chains on a desert world that most of the galaxy had never heard of and would not have cared about if it had. Tatooine is not a world that is kind to anyone. It sits at the outer edge of the galaxy, baking under two suns, a place of enormous distances and scarce water and a kind of bleached, unforgiving beauty that offers no sentiment about the lives lived on its surface. The Hutt crime lords operate there freely because the Republic has never considered a planet like Tatooine worth the cost of caring about. The people who live there are either hiding from something, which is common, or they are owned by someone, which is more common still. Anakin Skywalker came into the world as property. He did not choose this. He did not earn it. He did not do anything to deserve it. It was simply the condition that greeted him at birth, the first and most foundational fact of his existence, the frame through which he learned to understand what the universe was and how it treated people. Shmi Skywalker raised her son in that condition with a grace that defies easy description. She was warm, and she was strong, and she loved Anakin with the complete, unbounded love of a mother who understood that love might be the only thing she could give him that no one could take away. She taught him to be good inside a life that had every structural reason to produce hardness. She gave him kindness when cruelty would have been the easier lesson, but she could not protect him from what slavery does to a person at the level that goes below memory, below conscious thought, below the place that can be reached by tenderness or reassurance. She could not prevent him from understanding, at an age when most children are still learning what the world is, that his life was not his own, that the people he loved could be removed from him without notice or recourse, that his feelings did not matter to the systems that governed him, and that the universe was not arranged with his well-being in mind. These are the lessons that slavery teaches. They go in deep. They do not come back out. There is also something specific that happens to a child who is both enslaved and gifted. It creates a doubling of the experience of powerlessness, because the child is aware, constantly, of the distance between what they are capable of and what they are permitted to do with that capability. Anakin could win pod races that experienced adult pilots would not have survived. He could repair machines that professional mechanics struggled to understand. He could feel the Force moving through everything around him like a current that never stopped and never slowed, a constant presence that told him he was connected to something vast and significant and beyond the ordinary. And then he would come home to a junk shop and remember that none of it mattered, that his abilities made him valuable property and nothing more, that the extraordinary thing he was had not translated into any reduction in his chains. This gap between the awareness of one's own exceptional nature and the structural refusal of the world to acknowledge it does something particular to a person's psychology. It creates a hunger for validation that is proportional to the depth of its denial. It creates a sensitivity to being underestimated that is almost physical, and it creates, at the deepest level, a relationship to power that is not about dominance or cruelty, but about the simple, primal desire to never again be in a position where what you are is irrelevant to what is being done to you. Power, for Anakin, was never primarily about controlling others. It was always, at its root, about the terror of being controlled, about the memory of chains. And there is something else that Anakin learned on Tatooine that is crucial to everything that follows. Something that tends to get lost in the larger drama of chosen ones and dark sides and political conspiracies. He learned that he was extraordinary, not in the way that flattery teaches a child this, not in the hollow way of being told you are special without evidence. He learned it the way that actually lands and actually shapes a person, which is through experience. He was faster than he should have been. His reflexes were beyond anything natural. He could see things before they happened. He could build machines from scavenged parts that professional engineers would have struggled to reproduce. He felt the Force moving through him like weather, like a constant presence that informed everything he did, and he did not have a name for it yet. But he knew he was connected to something vast and real, in a way that the other children around him were not. He was 9 years old, and he already knew he was different in kind, not just in degree. That knowledge, in the absence of any structure that could hold it appropriately, became something complex and double-edged. The awareness of being extraordinary, when paired with the experience of being powerless, creates a particular kind of person. It creates someone who believes, at the level below argument, that the gap between what they are and what the world allows them to be is a problem that can and should be solved. Someone who does not accept limits the way ordinary people learn to accept limits. Because ordinary people accept limits because they have never had the experience of genuinely exceeding them. Anakin had. He exceeded every limit placed on him his entire childhood. And the limits kept coming anyway. And he never quite stopped believing that the right kind of power was the solution to that equation. He was 9 years old when Qui-Gon Jinn arrived on Tatooine with a queen and a Padawan and a small astromech droid. And the shape of Anakin's life changed in a single afternoon. Qui-Gon recognized what Anakin was before Anakin finished a sentence. He tested him, measured his blood, and found midichlorian counts that didn't match anything the Order's records contained. Higher than Yoda, higher than anyone. He saw in Anakin the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, the chosen one, who would bring balance to the Force, and he set about acquiring permission to bring Anakin to Coruscant with the quiet determination of a man who has decided something and is now simply waiting for the formalities to conclude. He won Anakin's freedom in a pod race. He did not win Shmi's freedom. He tried and failed, and made the decision that the galaxy's future outweighed the conscience of the moment, and he brought Anakin to Coruscant while Shmi stood in the sand and watched her son disappear into a ship. What Anakin took with him when he left Tatooine was not only the memory of his mother's face at that last moment. He took with him the experience of being freed while the person he loved most in the world remained enslaved. He was 9 years old. The Jedi would teach him to release his emotions and to find peace in the will of the Force. And he would try to do this, genuinely, for years. But you cannot simply instruct a wound to close. You can only wait and hope the conditions are right for healing. The conditions were not right. They were almost never right. And the wound stayed open, covered over by discipline and duty, and the forward momentum of an extraordinary life. But open underneath, waiting for the moment when something would apply enough pressure to break the cover apart. The Jedi Council met Anakin and found him remarkable and frightening in approximately equal measure. Master Yoda sensed great fear in him, which was accurate. Master Mace Windu had reservations about training someone so old, which by Jedi standards at 9 years old was genuinely old for initiation, since the Order preferred to begin with children who had not yet formed the attachments and emotional patterns that made later training more complicated. The Council voted against training him initially, and Qui-Gon told them he would train Anakin himself if necessary. And before that standoff could be resolved, Qui-Gon was dead on Naboo, killed by a Sith Lord that everyone had believed extinct for a millennium. And Obi-Wan Kenobi, grieving his master in the same breath that he was making his own commitment as a Jedi Knight, promised Qui-Gon in his final moments that he would train Anakin. The Council relented, not because they were convinced, because the circumstances had made refusal feel impossible. This is where the Jedi's first great failure with Anakin Skywalker begins. And it is worth sitting with, because it is a failure that compounds over years into something that becomes genuinely catastrophic. They accepted him reluctantly, trained him under a Padawan master, who was, himself, not yet a full Jedi Knight in the traditional sense, and never fully resolved their ambivalence about whether they should have brought him in at all. The Council watched Anakin across his entire career with a particular quality of attention that contained, underneath its surface of appropriate mentorship, an unmistakable note of wariness. They admired his abilities, They were also, always, a little afraid of them. And Anakin, who had grown up with finely calibrated senses for how others perceived him, learned to feel that wariness the way you learn to feel the presence of a draft in a room. It was always there. It was never directly addressed. It simply sat in the air between him and the Council, like something no one wanted to name. Obi-Wan Kenobi loved Anakin. This needs to be said clearly and without qualification, because the love was real, and it shaped both of them in ways that endured beyond everything that happened. Obi-Wan was not a cold man. He was, underneath the composure and the dry wit and the Jedi serenity, genuinely warm and genuinely invested in Anakin's growth, and genuinely proud of what Anakin became. But he was a Jedi, and the Jedi had shaped him in ways that went all the way down. And one of the ways the Jedi had shaped him was in how he expressed affection. Obi-Wan expressed affection through high standards, through critique offered in the expectation of better, through praise that was always present, but always also accompanied by a note of what could still be improved. He told Anakin he was proud of him, that he was his brother, but he said these things at moments of departure or in the aftermath of a crisis, rarely in the ordinary living moment when Anakin simply needed to hear them. The language of love that Obi-Wan spoke was not the language that Anakin was most fluent in receiving. Anakin, who had come from a world of direct and uncomplicated love between a mother and her child, who had then grown up in an institution that systemically discouraged the expression of personal attachment, needed something that the Jedi had almost structurally made impossible to give him. He needed to be told, simply and without condition, that he was enough, that he was loved not for his power or his potential, but for himself. No one said this to him, not in a way he could receive it. What the Jedi gave him instead, and this is important to understand, because it is not nothing, it is actually quite a great deal, was structure and purpose, and a framework through which his extraordinary abilities could be directed toward genuine good. They gave him a mission. They gave him a code. They gave him the context of the Force itself, that vast and ancient presence that he had always felt but had never had language for. And they gave him the vocabulary to engage with it consciously and deliberately. They gave him Obi-Wan, who shaped him into one of the finest Jedi who ever lived, and who genuinely loved him in the ways available to him. They gave him a galaxy to serve. These were not small gifts. They mattered. They were real. But they operated at the level of purpose and meaning and external contribution. And what Anakin was missing operated at a different level, one that purpose and meaning and external contribution cannot reach, no matter how substantial they are. You can feel called to something grand and still feel unseen by the people around you. You can be the most important Jedi of your generation and still feel, in the private center of yourself, that no one in your life is holding the whole of you rather than just the part of you that is useful to them. Into this particular absence stepped Palpatine, Chancellor Palpatine, Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, the most powerful elected official in the known galaxy, a man of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary patience, a man who had been positioning pieces on a board that most people could not see for longer than Anakin had been alive. He had identified Anakin Skywalker from the moment of their first meeting as the most important thing he would ever acquire. Not the most important ally, not the most important weapon, the most important thing. The instrument through which everything he had spent decades working toward would either be achieved or fail, and he understood with the absolute clarity of someone who has committed entirely to a single purpose that you do not acquire something like Anakin Skywalker through force or threat or simple manipulation. You acquire it through love, or through something that functions in every way exactly like love. From the perspective of the person receiving it, their first meeting happened when Anakin was 9 years old and had been on Coruscant for only a matter of days. He was still adjusting to a planet where the sky was a ceiling of metal and traffic rather than open stars and twin suns, still carrying the rawness of having left his mother behind in the desert, still in the strange, suspended state of someone whose entire life has just been changed by forces outside their control, and who has not yet had time to process what any of it means. Palpatine had sought this meeting deliberately. He was not the sort of person who allowed chance to deliver important encounters. He came to Anakin with warmth and with attention, and with a quality of genuine interest that Anakin almost never received from the adults around him. Where the Jedi Council looked at Anakin and saw a variable to be evaluated, Palpatine looked at Anakin and made him feel like the most interesting person in the room. He asked what Anakin dreamed about. He asked what he hoped for. He spoke to him not as a child to be managed, but as a person whose perspective had value. And he said, before they parted, that he would watch Anakin's career with great interest. And he said it with the particular warmth of someone who means it and knows that the person they are saying it to will carry it with them for a very long time. Palpatine was not doing this accidentally. Palpatine never did anything accidentally. The persona of the gracious and fatherly Chancellor was not a mask laid over his true self, so much as a performance so long practiced and so completely inhabited that the distinction had become academic. He was Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord who had been working for generations toward the destruction of the Jedi Order and the rise of the Sith Empire that Darth Bane had envisioned 1,000 years before. He had orchestrated the Trade Federation's invasion of Naboo to create the political crisis that allowed him to maneuver into the Chancellorship. He had positioned Count Dooku as his public-facing apprentice and the architect of the separatist movement, specifically to create a war that would justify the expansion of executive power and the militarization of the Republic. He had been patient in a way that most people are not capable of sustaining, because most people have too many competing needs and desires to stay perfectly committed to a single long-term objective across decades. Palpatine had no such competing needs. He had only the plan, and Anakin was the centerpiece of the plan. Not because Palpatine had manufactured Anakin, though there are those who have argued he may have, and that argument is more interesting than it first appears, but because Anakin was the only person in the galaxy with the raw force power to do what needed to be done. The destruction of the Jedi Order was not a task for ordinary soldiers or even for Sith in the traditional mode. The Jedi were too numerous, too skilled, too deeply embedded in the Republic's infrastructure for any external force to simply remove them. They had to be destroyed from within, by someone they trusted, by someone whose power was great enough to make the difference between a purge and a slaughter. Anakin Skywalker was the only candidate who met those requirements. And so the investment Palpatine made in him was not cynical in the transactional sense. In Palpatine's framework, it was entirely rational. You do not neglect the most important tool you will ever possess. You care for it. You sharpen it. You make sure it trusts you completely. And then, When the time comes, you use it. Year after year, across the whole span of Anakin's adolescence and into his adulthood, Palpatine tended to that investment. Every time Anakin returned from a difficult mission, Palpatine made himself available. Every time Anakin felt frustrated by the Council's decisions, Palpatine listened with the patient sympathy of a man who genuinely understood what it felt like to have your abilities underestimated by institutions more interested in maintaining their own authority than in recognizing genuine talent. He praised Anakin directly, and without the qualifying caution that characterized the Jedi's relationship with praise. He told Anakin that his gifts were extraordinary, that those who tried to limit him were afraid of what he was capable of, that the galaxy would one day recognize what Palpatine already knew. He positioned himself, across years of consistent attention, as the one person in Anakin's life who believed in him without reservation or agenda. And this was a gift so rare in Anakin's experience that he received it without ever fully examining the hands offering it. There is a thing that happens to people who are both extraordinary and starved of unconditional regard. A thing that is difficult to describe, but that anyone who has lived it will recognize. The ordinary channels through which most people receive validation, through peers who share their level and can genuinely appreciate their achievements, through mentors who can see what they are becoming and say so clearly, through institutions that acknowledge outstanding performance. All of these channels were either closed to Anakin or operating in ways that mixed their affirmation with reservation. The Jedi gave him complex praise. The Republic celebrated his battlefield successes, but saw him as a symbol rather than a person. Obi-Wan loved him, but expressed it in a language he had to translate. And so, when Palpatine offered something cleaner and more direct, it hit a note that nothing else in Anakin's life was hitting, and it kept hitting it consistently for years, until the relationship had become something that Anakin simply could not evaluate from outside. You cannot evaluate from outside something you are inside of. You cannot step back from the relationship that has functionally been filling the role of the unconditional love you have needed since you were 9 years old. You especially cannot do this when you are 22 and frightened and exhausted and watching your wife die in your dreams every night. The Clone Wars began at Geonosis and consumed the galaxy with a speed and completeness that surprised even those who had seen it coming. Anakin fought in it with everything he had, which was the only way he knew how to do anything. He became, in 3 years of almost constant combat, one of the most decorated and celebrated military figures the Republic had ever produced. The hero with no fear. The Jedi who never hesitated. The general whose tactical instincts bordered on precognition, which they sometimes literally were, because the Force does not distinguish neatly between genius and prescience in someone whose connection to it is as direct as Anakin's was. He won victories that should not have been winnable. He survived situations that should have killed him. He collected scars and glory in equal measure and kept moving, because movement was the one thing that kept the fear at a manageable distance. When you are in the middle of a battle, there is no room for the dream. There is no room for the image of a woman dying while you stand helpless. There is only the moment, and the next moment, and the one after that. War, for Anakin, had the quality of relief alongside all its other qualities. He had married Padme Amidala in secret on Naboo at the end of the Battle of Geonosis, with only the droids as witnesses and only the setting sun over the lake country as ceremony. She had resisted at first, or tried to, citing her duties as a senator and the impossibility of the situation and the very real risks that discovery would mean for both of them and for the work they each cared about. But the time on Naboo had worked on her resistance, and the time on Tatooine, with his grief and his rage and his need, had broken through the last of it. She had seen him at his worst and stayed. He had told her what he did to the Tusken Raiders, trembling in the workshop on Tatooine, half expecting her to recoil, and she had not recoiled. She had held him. That was the moment, more than any kiss or any declaration, that sealed what they were to each other. She had seen the darkness and stayed, and he had never forgotten it. For 3 years, they existed in the gaps between his deployments. Messages in code. Transmissions cut short by the demands of the war. Brief reunions that had to carry the weight of all the absence on both sides. He could not tell his brothers in the Order. He could not mention her name in any official context. She could not appear beside him at any public function without the careful construction of a plausible reason for her presence. The most important relationship of his life lived entirely underground, which meant it lived at an intensity that surface-level relationships rarely have to sustain. Every moment together was weighted by the knowledge of the next separation. Every reunion carried the accumulated pressure of every missed conversation and every crisis he had gone through alone, and every night she had spent worrying about news she could not afford to be seen receiving. This is not a sustainable way to love someone. It builds something that is fierce and consuming and entirely entangled with the constant, low-level fear of its own destruction. And for Anakin, who had already established a deep association between love and loss and the terror of powerlessness, it meant that his love for Padme had never been able to develop the ordinary calm that sustained loves eventually find. It was always lit from underneath by fear. It had been fear since the beginning. Since the first moment on Naboo, when he realized what she was to him and understood immediately that she was something that could be taken. His mother had been taken. This is the wound that everything else circles back to. The point at which all the roads in Anakin Skywalker's psychology eventually converge. He had had visions of her suffering on Tatooine. Visions that built in frequency and urgency until he could not ignore them. And he had gone to her, leaving Padme under the protection of Obi-Wan and going to the desert that had formed him. And he had arrived too late. A few hours, perhaps. A few hours earlier, and she might have lived. She had been in a Tusken camp, bound to a post, injured badly enough that her survival had been a matter of hours in any case by the time he found her. He had cut her down. He had held her. She had opened her eyes and recognized him, and told him he looked so handsome. And then she had died. The grief that came out of him in that moment was the kind of grief that does not cry. It was the kind that goes very quiet and very cold. And then, without any decision being consciously made, becomes something else. He had gone out into the camp with his lightsaber. He had killed every Tusken Raider he could find. The men, the women, the children, all of them. He had told Padme this afterwards, sitting in Watto's workshop on Mos Espa in the aftermath of it, trembling with a mixture of horror and defiance and grief that did not know where to direct itself. He had said that they were animals and he hated them. And then his voice had broken, and the person underneath the declaration had been visible for a moment, which was a person who was 20 years old and had just lost the only family he had in the galaxy and could not make sense of a universe in which something like this was allowed to happen. He had said that someday he would be so powerful that he could stop people from dying. It had sounded like the statement of someone in shock. It was actually the statement of someone making a decision. He was never going to be helpless like that again. He was going to find a way to hold on to the people he loved, whatever it cost, whatever path it required, whatever it asked of him. He was going to find a way. The Jedi, if he had gone to them with this feeling, would have told him that death was a natural part of the living force, that those who passed became one with it, that clinging to life was the beginning of the path to darkness. He did not go to them with this feeling. He carried it alone, the way he had always carried the things that mattered most to him, in the private space that the Jedi Code had made the only space available for feelings that didn't fit within its framework. The dreams started in the last year of the war. They were not vague or impressionistic. They were precise, which is the particular cruelty of prophetic force visions, that they are specific enough to be terrifying, but never quite specific enough to tell you how to prevent what they are showing. He saw Padme in a white medical facility, and she was dying, and there were machines around her and people who could not help, and he was there, and he could not help either. He saw her face losing color. He saw the life going out of her eyes. He woke from these dreams with absolute certainty, the bone-deep certainty that comes not from emotion but from the force itself moving through him, that what he was seeing was not imagination. He had had force visions before. He had seen his mother suffering before he went to her on Tatooine. He had learned, at a cost he would never stop paying, that his visions were not metaphors. They were warnings. And this one was telling him that Padme was going to die. The dreams came every night. Not always the same sequence. Sometimes it was her hands going still. Sometimes it was the sound of medical equipment and a silence that followed the equipment stopping. Sometimes it was her face turned toward him and her mouth moving and no sound coming out, as though she was saying something he needed to hear from across a distance too great to cross. He would wake in the darkness of his quarters in the temple and lie still for a moment, orienting himself back into the waking world. And the relief that it was only a dream would last for exactly as long as it took for him to remember that it was not only a dream. He was Anakin Skywalker. His dreams did not work the way other people's dreams worked. His dreams were information. And the information was that she was running out of time and that he had not yet found the way to stop it. The logic that then operated in him was a logic of someone who has already learned from personal experience that doing nothing is not a neutral position. Doing nothing on Tatooine had not prevented his mother's death. It had simply meant he arrived too late to prevent it. He was not going to do nothing this time. He was not going to surrender to the Jedi teaching that death must be accepted, that what is natural must be allowed to be natural. That attachment leads to suffering. He was not going to let the Force take Padme the way it had taken his mother while he stood by and practiced letting go. He was going to find a way to stop this. He did not know what that way was yet. He only knew that it existed, and that the Jedi probably did not have it. He went to Yoda. He did this in good faith, with genuine hope that the wisest being in the Order might have something to offer him beyond the standard instruction to release his emotions. He sat with the ancient master in his chambers and told him as much as he could tell him, which was that he was having visions of someone he cared about dying, and that he did not know how to bear this. He could not say Padme's name. To say her name would be to reveal the marriage, and to reveal the marriage would be to lose everything. And so he was trying to communicate the most important crisis of his life through a riddle that left out its most important element. Yoda listened. He sat with his eyes half closed in the way he had of listening that felt very old and very patient. And then he said the things that the Jedi had to say. He said that death is a natural part of life. He said that those who pass into the Force do not truly vanish but become part of something larger. He said that to mourn is natural, but to cling is the beginning of suffering. He said that the path to peace lay in the training of the self to let go of everything one feared to lose. This was wise. It was also, for Anakin in that specific moment, not useful in any practical sense. Because what Yoda was describing was a relationship to love and loss that Anakin had never been able to develop, had never been given the conditions to develop, and was being asked to suddenly embody in the middle of the most urgent crisis of his life. The counsel was real, and the wisdom behind it was genuine. But it required Anakin to become, in an instant, someone he had spent 22 years failing to become, someone the Jedi themselves had not fully equipped him to become, through no malice but through the simple practical limits of what an institution built around suppressing attachment can offer to a person whose attachment is the most defining feature of his inner life. Anakin walked out of that conversation more alone than he had walked in, more convinced than ever that the Jedi could not give him what he needed, and therefore more open than ever to whatever else might. The political pressure was also building in ways that were beginning to intersect with Anakin's private crises in increasingly uncomfortable ways. The Senate had, over 3 years of war, granted Palpatine emergency powers in a series of incremental steps, each one individually justifiable in the context of the conflict, each one collectively part of a pattern that the Jedi could see but could not easily address without overstepping their own mandate as servants of the Republic rather than its masters. Palpatine had not taken power in the way that tyrants in history's simpler stories take it. He had been given it, measure by measure, by a Senate that trusted him and by a Republic that was tired and frightened and willing to trade abstract freedoms for the concrete sense of someone competent being in charge. The Jedi, whose mandate was to protect and serve the Republic, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of watching the Republic hand itself to someone they were increasingly certain meant it harm, and not having a clear mechanism within their code or their institutional role for doing anything about it. They had begun to discuss among themselves in the guarded language that Jedi used for thoughts that troubled them, whether it might eventually be necessary to take direct action against Palpatine. Not assassination, not at first, but intervention of some kind, some action that would prevent him from using the crisis of the war to permanently consolidate the kind of power that should have required democratic mandate to hold. This was itself a significant departure from everything they were supposed to be. Guardians of peace, not political actors. Servants of the Republic, not its ultimate arbiters. They were aware of this departure and uncomfortable with it. But the alternative seemed worse, and so they continued to watch and to discuss and to move very carefully around the edges of a decision they were not yet ready to make. Then came the appointment. Palpatine announced that he was naming Anakin Skywalker, Jedi Knight, as his personal representative on the Jedi High Council. It was a politically constructed position that had no precedent. The Jedi were not members of the executive. The council was not an advisory body to the Chancellor. This appointment was Palpatine inserting himself into the Jedi's internal governance in a way that the Order could not simply refuse without a political confrontation they were not prepared to have publicly. They accepted the appointment. And then, in their chambers, they told Anakin what they had decided. He would sit on the council. He would not receive the rank of Jedi Master. The reasons were defensible. The rank of Master carried specific meaning within the Order, specific requirements that Anakin had not completed through the traditional paths, and accepting Palpatine's political appointment as grounds for automatic elevation would have set a troubling precedent about the relationship between Jedi standing and political patronage. These were not invented justifications. They were real concerns within the Order's own framework. But they were not what Anakin heard. What Anakin heard, sitting in that circle of the most senior Jedi alive, the only person in the room without the title that every other person in the room held, was this: you are still not trusted. After everything, after 3 years of war and hundreds of battles and every sacrifice and every campaign and every demonstration of ability that any other Jedi in the history of the Order would have had more than sufficient grounds to receive this rank, you are still not trusted enough. You are here because the Chancellor put you here, not because we chose you. We will accept your presence because we do not have an alternative. But we will not elevate you, because elevation would mean acceptance, and we are not ready to accept you without conditions. He said that it was unfair, and that the council was disrespectful. He said it in front of everyone. There was a silence. Mace Windu told him, with the quiet authority that Mace wielded like a secondary weapon, that he had been given a great honor and that he should take his seat. Anakin sat down. The meeting continued. The council moved on to other business because they had a war to manage and a chancellor to watch and a galaxy of problems that did not pause for the emotional weather of one Jedi Knight, however exceptional. And Anakin sat in his assigned chair and said nothing more and let the meeting happen around him. And the expression on his face was the expression of someone who has received a confirmation they had been hoping not to receive. It is worth pausing here, in this moment, before the next thing happens, because this is one of those junctures in a story where the tragedy is not yet complete, but is already visible to anyone looking carefully. Here is a man who has given everything he has to an order that will not give him its full trust, who has fought their war and bled for their cause and carried their mission into the darkest places of the galaxy and come back and done it again, who has, in the private space the Jedi Code allowed him, loved with everything he had and kept that love silent because it was what the code required, who came to this council not through his own ambition but through the Chancellor's appointment, and who received, in exchange for accepting a position he had not asked for, the explicit public statement that he was not quite good enough for its most basic credential. He was not a boy having a tantrum about a title. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life trying to earn something that the institution he had given that life to kept placing just slightly beyond his reach. The seat without the rank was a symbol, and he read it correctly, because he had always been able to read this particular signal clearly. He was welcome when useful. He was held at distance when the question was one of belonging. They were not finished with him yet. Having placed him on the council under political compulsion and declined to grant him the rank membership should have carried, They then made the request that cut against his sense of personal honor more deeply than almost anything else they could have asked. They asked him to spy on Palpatine. They told him that his proximity to the Chancellor, his access, his years of relationship were an asset the Order needed him to use. They wanted reports on Palpatine's activities, his conversations, the movements of his influence in the Senate and beyond. They wanted Anakin to use the closest thing he had to a father as an intelligence source. And they were asking this of a man they had just declined to fully trust with membership in their own order. Obi-Wan delivered this assignment. He did it with the careful gentleness of someone who understood that he was asking something genuinely difficult, and who believed, nonetheless, that the circumstances required it. He told Anakin it was for the good of the Republic. He told him the Council would be grateful. He said it with the warmth that Obi-Wan could deploy when the situation required it. The warmth that had always been real underneath the composure. And Anakin listened and agreed, and walked away from that conversation with the feeling of a man who has been asked to betray everything he values by the institution that is supposed to represent everything he values. Not the Jedi Code specifically, his own sense of what honor meant, of what loyalty meant, of what it meant to be trusted and to be worthy of trust. The Council was asking him to demonstrate their kind of loyalty by violating his own. He went to Palpatine. Not to report on him, not yet, not for that. Simply to talk the way they always talked. Because talking to Palpatine was still the closest thing Anakin had in his life to a conversation where he did not have to manage what he revealed. Palpatine, who had eyes in places Anakin could not have imagined, and who could read Anakin's emotional state, the way a physician reads a patient's vital signs, saw that something had shifted. Anakin was more brittle than usual, more tightly coiled, closer to an edge that had been moving slowly toward him for weeks. And Palpatine, being precisely who he was, offered what he had always offered when Anakin was struggling. He offered warmth and time and interest, and he took Anakin to the galaxy's opera house on Coruscant, where a Mon Calamari water ballet was being performed. And in that soft light, with the performance moving below them in the vast space of the auditorium, he began to speak about things he had never spoken about directly before. He told Anakin that the Jedi were not the only tradition that had ever understood the Force. He spoke of the Sith, not with horror, the way the Jedi spoke of them, but with a kind of measured academic interest, as though these were historical figures worth understanding, rather than simply condemning. He said that the dark side of the Force had abilities that some considered unnatural, and then he told Anakin the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise, a Sith Lord of such extraordinary attunement to the Force that he had learned to influence midichlorians themselves, to create life, and in his greatest achievement, to prevent death. He said that Plagueis had been so powerful that the one thing he could not save himself from was his own apprentice. He said that this was not a Jedi tale. He said, with the particular lightness of someone dropping something very heavy, that the Jedi did not teach such things. He left it there. He did not press further. He did not say, the power to prevent death is real. He did not say, I can teach you. He simply placed the idea in the room and allowed Anakin to live inside it. Palpatine had spent 13 years preparing for this moment. He understood that the worst thing he could do now was push. Anakin was too intelligent and too proud to be pushed without feeling it. but a man who has been hearing his wife die in his dreams for weeks, and who has been told repeatedly by the only institution he belongs to that his only option is to let go. That man hears a story about the power to prevent death differently than he would have heard it at any other moment in his life. He heard it as possibility. He heard it as the thing that had been missing from every other conversation he had tried to have about this. The Jedi had told him to accept death. Palpatine had just told him that someone had found a way to make death optional. The Jedi had told him that the power he was looking for did not exist, or that, if it existed, it was forbidden. Palpatine had told him that the Jedi simply did not know about it, or chose not to teach it, which was a different thing entirely. And the distinction between does not exist and the Jedi have not told you about it was, in the mind of someone who had spent 22 years watching the gap between what the Jedi offered and what he actually needed, a very significant distinction indeed. Anakin asked, in the quiet of the auditorium, whether it was possible to learn this power. Palpatine said that not from a Jedi. He did not elaborate. He let it end there. He knew, with the patience of a man who had been waiting his entire life for the right moment, that he did not need to say another word. The seed was planted in the only soil that could have received it. The rest would happen on its own. Driven by the dreams and the fear and the thing Anakin could not do, which was to let go of Padme, the way Yoda had advised him to let go of everything he feared to lose. The days that followed were some of the most turbulent of Anakin's interior life, and his interior life had never been a particularly quiet place. He was sitting on the Jedi Council, but held at arm's length by it. He was being asked to spy on someone he loved. His wife was dying in his dreams every night. He was carrying the secret of a marriage that could not be spoken of, and a pregnancy that both thrilled and terrified him. Because the pregnancy was visible in ways a marriage could be hidden. Because the pregnancy was the thing that would eventually make the secret impossible. Because the pregnancy was, in the darkness of his most frightened thoughts, connected in ways he could not fully articulate to the woman dying in the white room in his visions. He was 22 years old. He had never once in his life been able to put everything down and simply rest. He did not know how. He had not been taught. The Jedi had taught him focus and combat and philosophy and how to center himself in the Force. They had not taught him how to rest. He did not know that this was something that needed to be taught. He had always understood rest as the temporary absence of pressure rather than the active cultivation of something he was missing. Padme told him she was pregnant. She said it simply, directly, with the composure she brought to most important things, even when what was underneath was not composed at all. He held her, and he felt, simultaneously, a wave of joy so complete it almost made him forget everything else, and a wave of cold terror that confirmed everything the dreams had been telling him. The joy was real. The terror was also real. They coexisted inside him, the way opposites always coexisted inside him, without resolving into each other, without either one canceling the other out. He told her everything would be fine. He believed this in the way that people believe things they cannot afford not to believe, with the part of the mind that has decided and the part of the body that is already preparing for the alternative. He went, one more time, to the Jedi. Not to the Council this time. Not to the body that had just demonstrated clearly where its limits were with him. He went to Mace Windu, directly and specifically, because what he had to say required someone with the authority to act on it. And because Mace, whatever the tensions between them, was someone Anakin trusted to do what the situation required. He had discovered something that the Order needed to know. He was going to tell them. He found Mace Windu in the temple and told him, without preamble or softening, that he believed Palpatine was the Sith Lord the Jedi had been searching for. He said it directly, the way he said difficult things, and waited. Mace listened with the controlled attention that was his characteristic mode. He absorbed the information with the stillness of someone who is receiving confirmation of a suspicion rather than news of a surprise. He said that this was a matter the Council would handle. He said that Anakin should go to his quarters and wait there. He said it with the flat authority of a decision already made, and then he gathered himself and left to summon the other masters who would come with him to the Chancellor's office. There was something in the way Mace left that room that said everything about who Mace Windu was and why. Despite his extraordinary abilities and his genuine commitment to the Jedi cause, he was exactly the wrong person to be handling Anakin Skywalker on this specific night. Mace was not cold. He was not indifferent to Anakin's complexity or to what it had cost him to come here with this information. But Mace was a man of absolute conviction, a man whose certainty about what was right and what was necessary had carried him through situations that would have broken most people, and that same certainty did not leave room for the management of an emotional reality that was not the most operationally urgent thing in the room. There was a Sith Lord to confront. There was a decision to be made. There was no time, in Mace's framework, to do the thing that might have changed everything, which was to stop for one moment and look at Anakin and acknowledge what he had just done, what it had cost, what he was feeling. Mace did not do this. He did what soldiers and generals and guardians do, which is to move immediately toward the objective. He left, and Anakin was alone. Anakin stood in the empty space Mace left behind and felt something he could not fully name. He had done the right thing. He had come to the Jedi with information they needed and given it honestly, at cost to himself, at the cost of the relationship he was betraying by reporting it, and they had told him to go to his room. He had been told to wait in his room. Again, the way he had always been told to wait, to step back, to let the senior Jedi handle it, to trust that the wisdom of the Order would manage what his own abilities and information had made possible. The same message he had received when they declined his rank. The same message he received every time the Council treated his role as that of an instrument to be used rather than a person to be included. Go to your quarters. We will take it from here. He stood there for a moment, and then he could not stay. The pull toward Palpatine's office was not, in that moment, a pull toward the dark side. It was not, in that specific instant of leaving the temple, a conscious choice to betray the Jedi or embrace anything Palpatine had offered him. It was something below the level of decision. It was the dream. It was the persistent, bone-deep, Force-confirmed certainty that something happening across the city was connected to whether his wife lived, and that he could not sit across the city from it and wait for other people to determine its outcome. He had done that on Tatooine. He had felt the pull of his mother's suffering across the planet, and he had waited, and waited, and eventually gone. And he had arrived too late. He was not going to arrive too late again. He could not survive arriving too late again. He had barely survived it the first time. The part of him that had not survived it was the part that had been able to trust the universe to take care of the people he loved. And that part was simply gone, and nothing the Jedi had offered him in the years since had been able to replace it. He did not know. As he moved through the temple corridors toward the landing platform, as he took a speeder into the Coruscant night, as the city opened up around him in all its endless illuminated complexity, exactly what he was walking toward. He knew only that it mattered more than anything that had come before it, and that whatever happened in that office was going to change everything, and that he was going to be there when it happened. He was right about that last part. He was going to be there. He just did not yet know what being there was going to cost. He did not know that the next few minutes would be the last few minutes in which Anakin Skywalker still existed in any meaningful sense. He did not know that the person who flew that speeder toward the Senate building was the last version of himself that could have turned around, gone back, chosen something different. He did not know any of this. He knew only what he had always known, which was that the people he loved were the thing worth protecting above everything else, and that he was moving toward a place where that protection might still be possible. He had moved toward his mother too late. He was not going to make that mistake again. He was never going to make that mistake again. Whatever it cost, whatever came next, Mace Windu did not go to Palpatine's office in haste. This is worth noting, because haste would have been understandable given the gravity of what Anakin had just told him. But haste was not Mace's way, and it was especially not Mace's way when the stakes were high enough that a single mistake could be catastrophic. He moved with the deliberateness of someone who has already made their decision and is now simply executing it. He gathered 3 of the finest Jedi Masters alive. Kit Fisto, whose placid competence in combat had never been seriously tested and had never been found wanting. Mace, a Jedi whose connection to the Force in battle was almost purely instinctive, who fought the way some people breathe, without apparent effort and without apparent limit. And Agent Kolar, one of the most formidable duelists in the Order's recent history, a man whose calm in combat had a quality to it that went beyond training, into something that seemed almost constitutional, as though the part of most people that experiences fear had simply been arranged differently in him. With these 3, Mace walked through the temple toward the landing platform, and there was a quality to that walk that those who saw it would not have been able to describe easily. It was not rushed. It was not uncertain. It was the walk of a man going to do something that needed to be done, and who had decided, somewhere in the space between receiving information and leaving the building, that there was only one way this could end. Palpatine needed to be stopped. Palpatine was a Sith Lord. Sith Lords who had been operating at this level for this long, who had orchestrated a war across the entire galaxy as a means to an end, who had constructed a political position from which they could reshape the entire order of civilization, did not come quietly. Mace understood this. He was not naive about it. He was perhaps the Jedi most genuinely equipped by both temperament and fighting style to handle what he expected to find when the door to the Chancellor's office opened. And so he walked toward it with all of that knowledge in him, and with none of it softened by hope that it might be simpler than it was. What none of them were fully prepared for, because being fully prepared for it would have required a degree of imagination that even the most experienced Jedi might not have been able to sustain, was the precise nature of Palpatine's abilities. They knew he was a Sith Lord. They had suspected it for long enough that it had become something close to certainty, and certainty had given them time to prepare in the ways they knew how to prepare, which were considerable ways. What they had not fully reckoned with was the gap between knowing that someone is extraordinarily dangerous and standing in the same room with them and experiencing what that danger actually feels like when it is directed at you. Palpatine was not simply a powerful Sith. He was the most powerful Sith who had ever lived, or very nearly so. A being who had spent over 80 years refining his mastery of the dark side, while concealing it from people who were specifically trained to detect it. He had hidden from Yoda. He had hidden from the entire Jedi Council for decades. The depth of ability required to do that is not something the intellect can truly scale properly until it is encountered directly in a small office above the Coruscant night, with lightsabers already drawn and the air already changed by the presence of that much dark side power concentrated in one room. Palpatine let them speak their piece. He allowed the moment of confrontation to have its form, the announcement of charges, the declaration of intent, the framing of what was about to happen inside the vocabulary of law and justice, that the Jedi still, even here, even now, were reaching for. He let them finish, and then he moved. What happened in the next few seconds was not a duel in any sense that a student of lightsaber forms would recognize as a fair application of the word. It was closer to a demonstration. Palpatine drew his lightsaber from the sleeve of his robe in a motion so practiced and so explosive that the transition from stillness to violence was essentially imperceptible, a single fluid moment that began with an old man sitting in a chair and ended with a red blade already in motion. Ajan Kolar died first. Then Saesee Tiin. These were masters. These were among the finest fighters in the Order. Beings who had survived decades of the Clone Wars and dozens of engagements with enemies of extraordinary capability. And they were gone in seconds, cut down by something moving faster than their responses could accommodate, by a ferocity of attack that contained no hesitation and no mercy, and nothing that resembled the combat of someone who had ever worried about losing. Kit Fisto lasted longer. Not much longer, but long enough to register what was happening, which meant long enough to understand that the gap between what he had been prepared to face and what was actually in front of him was not a gap he was going to be able to close. He fought with everything he had. It was not enough. The third master fell, and now it was only Mace Windu, and the room that had contained 4 Jedi Masters 30 seconds ago contained one, and the one who remained was looking at Palpatine across the body of his colleagues and feeling, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, the full weight of what it meant to face something that was not simply dangerous, but genuinely, cosmically malevolent. Mace did not break. This is the essential thing about him, the thing that defines him as much as his fighting ability or his judgment or any of the other qualities for which he was known. He did not break. He assessed. He's centering himself in the Force with the rapidity of someone for whom that process had been so thoroughly practiced that it no longer required time. And he brought his lightsaber up, and he began to fight. Mace Windu's lightsaber form was called Varpad. He had created it himself, developed it as the 7th form of lightsaber combat, and it was a form unlike any other in the Jedi tradition. Most lightsaber forms drew on the light side of the Force for their power, using its energy to enhance speed, strength, and clarity. Varpad did something more complicated and more dangerous. It channeled the dark side as well, not by drawing on the practitioner's own darkness, but by absorbing and redirecting the darkness of the opponent. A Varpad duelist fighting a Sith Lord was, in a sense, using the Sith Lord's own dark side energy against them, creating a circuit of violence that fed on the negative force flowing between combatants. It was extraordinarily effective. It was also extraordinarily dangerous, because you cannot channel darkness without touching it, and not everyone who touched Varpad came back from that contact unchanged. Mace had come back. He had mastered the form specifically because he acknowledged, with the unflinching honesty that was one of his most notable qualities, that he himself had darkness in him, and that the only way to keep that darkness from becoming corruption was to face it directly, to know it completely, and to choose every single time not to be consumed by it. Against Palpatine, Varpad made Mace Windu something that the other three masters had not been. He was not simply a target, he was a mirror. Every wave of dark side energy that Palpatine directed at him was absorbed and sent back, multiplied, incorporated into Mace's own assault in a way that created a feedback loop of force and fury that built with every exchange. Palpatine found, for perhaps the first time in decades of operating with a sense of invulnerability that had become so habitual it was almost indistinguishable from certainty, that the person in front of him was not falling behind. Mace was keeping pace. Then Mace was gaining. To understand what this means, you have to understand what Varpad actually does. Not just as a description of a combat form, but as a philosophical and force-based position. Most lightsaber forms are essentially defensive at their root, built around the idea that the Jedi is a guardian whose role is to protect and who uses force only in the service of that protection. Even the more aggressive forms, the ones that favor the offense or that draw on the practitioner's own power rather than deflecting the opponent's, operate within a framework that assumes the light side of the Force as the source of what the Jedi brings to a fight. Varpad does not assume this. Varpad assumes that the practitioner has darkness in them, that this darkness is real and present and not to be suppressed or denied, and that the correct relationship to it is not suppression but conscious incorporation. Mace had darkness. He had acknowledged this about himself, with the kind of unflinching honesty that most people, Jedi included, find very difficult to sustain about themselves. He had acknowledged it and then built a system for engaging with it that did not let the darkness win, but did not pretend the darkness was not there. This gave him something almost unique in the Order, a genuine relationship with the shadow side of the Force that did not corrupt him because he had already looked at it directly and chosen, knowingly and repeatedly, not to be consumed by it. Against a Sith Lord, this was not a small advantage. It was the decisive advantage. Because a Sith Lord fighting a Jedi who will not acknowledge the dark side is fighting someone who has, in a sense, left half the battlefield unoccupied. Against Mace Windu, there was no unoccupied battlefield. Every inch was contested. Every wave of darkness was returned. The duel moved through the Chancellor's office with the particular catastrophic grace of two beings at the absolute limit of what any organic creature could do with a lightsaber and a connection to the Force. Furniture exploding and walls cracking and the windows straining under the pressure of forces that had no business existing in a room designed for administrative meetings. And through all of it, Mace advanced. And Palpatine, step by measured step, began to give ground. This is the moment that most people rush past when they tell this story, because what comes after it seems so decisive that the before loses some of its significance. But this moment matters enormously, because Palpatine being pushed back by Mace Windu was not simply a combat outcome. It was information. It was the Force through the medium of this fight. revealing something about the architecture of the situation that changed everything. Mace was winning, not performing well, not holding his own, not surviving, winning. The most powerful Sith Lord who had ever existed was being driven back by a single Jedi Master, and the gap between them was closing, and there was a version of what happened next in which Mace landed the blow that ended it, in which the Sith were finished that night in a Chancellor's office in Coruscant, in which the Jedi Order survived, and the war ended, and the Empire never rose. That version existed. It was real. And then a speeder landed on a platform below, and the door opened, and Anakin Skywalker walked in. He had come through the night at speed, the Coruscant skyline streaming past him in lines of light. His mind not quiet and not loud, but doing something in between. A kind of focused emergency processing that had no room in it for anything except the trajectory he was on and the reason for it. He had left the temple. He was going to Palpatine's office. He did not know exactly what he would find there or what he would do about it. He knew only that he could not stay in his room while this was happening. That was the entirety of the reasoning, if you could call it reasoning, that had carried him out of the temple and across the city. The inability to stay still when the thing that mattered most to him was in motion somewhere he was not. He came in through the entrance to Palpatine's private office and heard the fight before he saw it, the high singing crash of lightsabers meeting, and the groan of something structural giving way. And then he came around the edge of what had been the door and saw the scene, and his mind did something that it very rarely did. It stopped. Palpatine was against the window. His arms were up, his lightsaber was gone, and Mace Windu had the blade of his purple lightsaber pressed close enough to the Chancellor's face that the light of it was visible in the old man's eyes. Palpatine was hunched, and his face was not the face Anakin knew, or rather, it was a different version of that face. A version in which the elegant lines of the man he had known for 13 years had been replaced by something older and raw and more terrible. The corruption of the dark side was showing on him the way it sometimes showed on powerful dark side users who had sustained the concealment of their true nature for very long periods and were now, in the extremity of combat, letting the mask slip. His eyes were yellow. His skin had the quality of something that had been held too close to a dark flame for too long. He looked, in that moment, like exactly what he was, which was a Sith Lord who had been hiding inside the face of a statesman for decades and who was now, perhaps for the first time in Anakin's experience of him, showing his true self. Anakin stood in the entrance and took all of this in, and the part of him that had spent the last several weeks trying to find a way to save Padme and coming up against the limits of what the Jedi could offer him, heard something in that moment that it had not expected to hear. The man who had told him about Darth Plagueis, the man who had said not from a Jedi, the man who was the only possible source of the knowledge that might keep his wife alive, was currently about to be killed by Mace Windu, by the Jedi, by the institution that had declined to help him and asked him to spy and told him to release his attachment and denied him his rank and sent him to his room. They were about to kill the one person who might be able to give him what they could not. He was across the room in less than a breath. Mace spoke. His voice was flat and certain, in the way that Mace's voice was always flat and certain. When he had decided something, he said that Palpatine was too dangerous to be left alive. He said it without looking at Anakin. He said it with the total focus of a man for whom the mission and the moment were the only things that existed, and the mission and the moment were clear. The Sith Lord was beaten. The threat was over. It ended here. Anakin said that he needed to stand trial. That it was not the Jedi way to execute someone who had been disarmed. That there were things Palpatine knew that they needed. He was not wrong about any of this, technically. The Jedi Code did not sanction execution. The principle of due process did matter. And Palpatine did know things that were relevant. But these were not the real reasons Anakin said what he said. The real reason was the one he had carried across the entire city in the speeder. The one that had been driving everything since the first night he saw Padme dying in the dream. He said the words of principle and law because those were the available words. Because he could not say what he actually meant, which was that he needed Palpatine alive because Palpatine was the only one who knew how to stop her from dying. There is something devastating in watching someone reach for the right language in a moment when the right language does not exist, when the honest version of what you are trying to say cannot be said for reasons that themselves cannot be explained without revealing everything you have been hiding. Anakin could not say he needed Palpatine alive because Palpatine had promised him a way to save his wife. He could not say this because it would mean admitting the marriage, the pregnancy, the 3 years of secret, all of it, in front of Mace Windu, who would then understand that Anakin had a personal stake in this outcome that had nothing to do with justice or the Jedi Code. He could not say any of the true things, so he said the available things. And Mace heard them and evaluated them and did not find them sufficient, and told Anakin as much, and went back to what he was doing. Mace said he had already made his decision, and Anakin looked at Mace Windu, the man who had never fully trusted him, who had denied him his rank, and told him to sit down, and then told him to wait in his room. And he looked at Palpatine, the man who had given him warmth and attention and a decade of unconditional regard, and a story about a Sith Lord who had learned to prevent death. And the choice that was in front of him was not between the Jedi and the Sith, not in that moment, not in the terms that history would eventually use to describe it. The choice was between Mace Windu killing the last source of hope he had, and Anakin preventing that from happening. He was not choosing the dark side. He was choosing Padme. He was choosing the woman in the dreams. The woman whose face he had loved since he was 9 years old. The woman carrying his child. The woman who was the only thing in a universe that had always been prepared to take everything from him that he had managed to hold on to. He was choosing her with everything he had, with the whole force of who he was. The boy from Tatooine and the Jedi Knight, and the husband who had kept the secret for 3 years, and the man who had sworn on his mother's grave that he would never be powerless again. All of that compressed into a single instant of decision that lasted less than a second and would last the rest of his life. His lightsaber came out of his hand. The blade crossed the space between them. Mace Windu's hand fell away from his wrist, still holding the purple lightsaber. The sound it made when it hit the floor was not loud. The room was already so full of the sounds of the previous minutes that one more impact barely registered. But it registered for Mace. He looked at what had happened to his arm with the expression of a man who has had a thing confirmed that he had long suspected but had hoped would not be confirmed this way. He looked at Anakin, and then he had no more time to look at anything, because Palpatine straightened, and the face that had been broken and beaten and showing something like defeat shifted into something entirely different, and the lightning came. It came in a torrent, not the careful, controlled application of force lightning that a Sith uses in combat as a measured weapon. This was the unrestricted release of a being that had been holding everything back for decades, and was now in the space of a single decisive moment, letting it all out. It hit Mace Windu in the chest and in the face and drove him back through the office with a force that made the earlier lightsaber duel look restrained. The window behind him was gone, or had simply ceased to matter, and Mace was in the air, and then he was in the open air above Coruscant, and then he was falling, shrinking, becoming smaller with every second, until the night took him, and there was only the rain of shattered transparent steel, and the howl of the wind through the broken window, and the silence that came after. The question of whether Mace Windu survived that fall has never been fully answered, and it may never be. What can be said is that Mace Windu was a Jedi Master of such extraordinary ability that the case for his survival is considerably stronger than it might appear in the moment of watching him fall. He was a practitioner of Varpad, which means he was someone with an unusually developed relationship to the boundary between survival and its opposite. Someone who had spent decades training his body and his force connection specifically to function under conditions of extreme violence and extreme darkness. Jedi have survived falls from comparable heights. Jedi have been struck by Force lightning and survived. The combination of these things is rarer, but Mace Windu was not an ordinary Jedi. Samuel L. Jackson, who gave the character his physical presence and whose affection for the role has never been in doubt, has stated on multiple occasions that he believes Mace survived, and while an actor's wishes for their character are not canon, they are not nothing either. Particularly when the character in question is someone whose established abilities make survival genuinely plausible. What is certain is that if Mace Windu found a way to cushion that fall, to use what remained of his Force connection in those final seconds to redirect his descent, to find some surface or shadow or corner of Coruscant's endless vertical architecture in which to disappear, he would have emerged into a galaxy that had just changed in every way that mattered. The temple burning, the clones turning, the Empire rising. Whatever came next for him, if anything came next, would have been the story of a man rebuilding everything he had believed in from the foundation, up in a galaxy that believed him dead, carrying the weight of having come so close to ending it before it began. Palpatine stood at the edge of that silence. His face, which had been showing something like exhaustion and defeat only moments earlier, was not showing those things anymore. What it was showing was something older and colder and more complete. The satisfaction of a man who has spent a very long time on a plan that has just arrived, precisely at the outcome he designed. He looked at Anakin. He did not say, "You have done well," though he might have, because that was the register of the relationship they had, the mentor acknowledging the student. Instead, he said something simpler. He called Anakin what Anakin was now, in the taxonomy of the thing that had just happened. He called him what he would be called from this moment forward, Lord Vader. Anakin had not moved from the spot where he had raised his lightsaber. He was still standing there, in the same place, with the same posture, looking at the window that no longer existed and the night that had replaced it. The hand that had held the lightsaber was still extended slightly, the same gesture it had been making when the blade crossed the space between itself and Mace Windu's wrist. He had not lowered his arm yet. He had not moved at all. He was standing completely still in the way that people sometimes go completely still when the full consequence of something they have just done arrives ahead of schedule. What he had done was beginning to arrive. He had betrayed a Jedi. He had raised his weapon against a fellow member of the Order in the middle of a confrontation with a Sith Lord. He had disarmed the most senior Jedi in the room at the moment, most critical to the Jedi's survival. He had, in a single motion that took less than a second to complete, placed himself on a side. And the side he had placed himself on was not the one that had trained him or commissioned him or called him their own. The side he had placed himself on was the one standing at the window looking at him with yellow eyes and something that resembled satisfaction. He had done this for Padme. He had done it with love, which is the most important thing to say about it, because the dark side does not always enter through rage or hatred or ambition. Sometimes it enters through love, which is what makes it so complete and so irreversible. Because a person who has done something monstrous in the service of hatred can eventually come to hate the hatred. But a person who has done something monstrous in the service of love will defend it for much longer, because to condemn the action is to condemn the motive. And the motive was everything good in him. The motive was the boy who loved his mother, and the husband who loved his wife, and the man who had refused for 22 years to accept that love was supposed to be let go of. He had crossed the line carrying everything that was best about him. And that was why he could not step back across it. Not yet. Not tonight. What happens to a person in the immediate aftermath of a choice like this is not well described by any of the frameworks that people typically use to understand conversion or corruption or the turn to darkness. The dramatic version of this story, the version that makes it a clean narrative of seduction and fall, imagines a moment of conscious decision followed by a kind of psychological arrival, a settling into the new identity. That is not what happened. What happened was more like standing in a room that has just changed shape around you, where the walls are in different places than they were a moment ago, and the exits you were planning to use no longer exist, and you have not yet had time to map the new geometry. Anakin was still Anakin. He was also something else now. These two things were both true simultaneously, and they would remain simultaneously true for a very long time, layered over each other in a way that neither resolved into the other nor separated cleanly. The old self and the new label and the vast space between them. He said he did not know what he was doing. Palpatine said that he did. Palpatine said it gently, which was the particular horror of it, that the most decisive moment of Anakin's destruction was framed by the same warmth and the same gentleness that had characterized every conversation they had ever had. He said that Anakin's allegiance was to him now. He said it as a fact rather than as a demand. He said that together they would save Padme. He said it in the language of everything Anakin had been looking for, and he said it standing at the window where Mace Windu had disappeared into the night, and he said it in a voice that did not sound like triumph, even though it was, and Anakin knelt. He said he would do whatever Palpatine asked. The words went out of him, and they did not come back. There is a particular quality to certain moments of surrender, a completeness to them that is different from the incompleteness of most decisions. Most decisions leave something unresolved, some thread of alternative still living at the edge of the choice, some small space where a different outcome still feels possible if circumstances shift. The moment Anakin knelt and said those words, that space closed. Not because Palpatine took it, because Anakin gave it. He offered his will to the man standing above him, and the offering was genuine, because for Anakin, everything genuine had always been total. He did not love partially. He did not commit partially. He did not surrender partially. He gave Palpatine everything he had in that moment, which was everything he was, which was the most powerful, Force-sensitive being alive. Palpatine bent and took it. And then he began to explain what happened next. The Jedi, he said, were the enemy, not the Sith, not the Separatists who were already dealt with, who had always been a tool rather than a genuine faction. The Jedi, they had attempted to overthrow the Republic. They had sent 4 masters to assassinate the Supreme Chancellor. They had been plotting against the democratic will of the people they claimed to serve. He said this with the calm confidence of someone who knows that the distinction between a lie and the truth depends entirely on who is left standing to tell the story, and who had spent a lifetime arranging to be the one still standing. He said that the Jedi had to be destroyed. He said that Anakin, who had the access and the ability, would help in this. He said it with the weight of a thing already decided rather than a thing being proposed. Because it was already decided, it had been decided for decades, and Anakin's kneeling was simply the last piece that had needed to be in place. He gave Anakin a new name. He told him he was now Darth Vader. The first syllable of the name was a word in the old Sith language for darkness. The second syllable was a word for father, Dark Father. It was not accidental. Nothing Palpatine did was accidental. The march on the Jedi Temple began at night. It began with Anakin at the head of the 501st Legion of clone troopers, the legion he had commanded for 3 years. The soldiers who had followed him across dozens of campaigns and who trusted him without question, because 3 years of shared combat builds a kind of loyalty that does not easily accommodate doubt. They did not know what they were marching toward in the way that would have made most of them refuse. They followed because following was what they had been engineered to do. Literally, their behavioral conditioning going deeper than training or choice, all the way down into the biological level of what they were. They followed because they had always followed him. They followed because Order 66 was already in effect across the galaxy, and the clones were already becoming something different from what the Jedi had believed they were, and the machinery of the Purge was already running, and Anakin was simply the piece of it that was pointed at the temple. He did not hesitate at the door. This is important to understand, because hesitation would have meant something surviving in him that was still Anakin Skywalker, in the way he had been Anakin Skywalker before the window. And what was inside the temple were Jedi, his brothers and sisters in the Force, the people he had grown up with and trained beside and fought alongside for a decade. They were not enemies. They were, in any ordinary frame of reference, the people he loved, second only to Padme. He did not hesitate. He walked in, and the clones walked in behind him, and the temple, which had stood for 1,000 years, began to die. What happened inside is not the kind of thing that can be described cleanly, because the events themselves do not have clean edges. The Jedi inside did not know what was coming. Some of them were in meditation. Some were in training exercises. Some were in the archives, or the council chambers, or the corridors between these places. The ones who sensed it first, who felt the shift in the Force that accompanied the arrival of something catastrophic, had only seconds of warning. And seconds is not enough to prepare for a targeted assault by 500 trained soldiers and a Force sensitive of Anakin's capability, who is operating without restraint. The Jedi fell. The ones who fought fell. The ones who ran fell. The ones who tried to reach the communication systems to warn others were cut off before they could. The temple, room by room and corridor by corridor, was taken. And then Anakin found the younglings. They had gathered in one of the training rooms. They were children, the youngest members of the Order, the ones who had not yet been assigned to a master, who were still in the early stages of their initiation into what it meant to be Jedi. They did not understand what was happening. They could feel that something was very wrong. One of them, a small boy, came to Anakin and called him Master Skywalker and asked what they were supposed to do, because there were too many of them and the younger ones were afraid, and he could feel things through the Force that he did not have the vocabulary to describe yet. Anakin looked at him, and in a moment that the galaxy would carry as one of its defining shames, for as long as the memory of the Jedi survived, he ignited his lightsaber. Across the galaxy, in the same hours, the clone troopers were carrying out Order 66 against the Jedi on 1,000 fronts. On Utapau, where Obi-Wan Kenobi had just killed General Grievous and was celebrating the end of what had seemed the last major obstacle to the war's conclusion, the clones turned. On Kashyyyk, where Yoda was fighting alongside the Wookiee warriors. On Felucia and Salikami and Megiddo and a dozen other battlefields where Jedi generals had led their clone troops for 3 years through hardship and victory and everything in between, the clones turned. The signal had gone out. The conditioning had activated, and Jedi who had stood for the light through the darkest of circumstances found themselves surrounded by soldiers they had believed were their brothers, and were wrong. Most of them died without understanding why. The betrayal was too sudden and too complete for understanding to arrive before the end. They fell in the field or in the cockpit or in the command post, cut down by people they had trusted, people who had seemed to trust them in return, people who had been changed at a level too deep for any relationship built on the surface to detect. The Force screamed with the deaths. Those sensitive enough and still living felt it like a physical blow. The absence of so many presences, simultaneously withdrawn from the living Force at once. Yoda felt it on Kashyyyk and was driven to his knees. Obi-Wan Kenobi felt it on Utapau and survived the clone fusillade that followed only through the intervention of the Wookiees and the chaos of the terrain. What is important to understand about Order 66, and what is sometimes lost in the speed and spectacle of what it looked like from the outside, is what it meant from the inside, from the perspective of each Jedi who felt their world narrow to a single point of violence in a single moment. These were people who had dedicated their lives to something, not just to the Jedi Code in the abstract, not just to the institutional identity of the Order, but to what the Order pointed toward, to the protection of life, to the principle that the Force was a guide towards something better than what power alone could build. They had given everything to this. They had released their families and their personal ambitions and their attachments and their private selves into it, had poured themselves into the service of a galaxy that mostly did not know their names, and they had done it because they believed the thing they were serving was real and worth serving. The soldiers who killed them had eaten beside them, had slept beside them, had trusted them to lead well and had been led well, had survived things together that create the kind of bond that should be unbreakable, and the bond had broken anyway, because the conditioning went deeper than the bond, and the Order had always been deeper than anyone thought. The Jedi Order, 3,000 years old, built by beings who had dedicated their lives to understanding the Force and protecting the lives of others, was broken in a single night. Not weakened, not damaged, broken. The few who survived were scattered and isolated, and in most cases did not know for some time whether any other survivors existed at all. The institution that had been the Order's primary defense against the dark side for millennia was gone, and in its place was a new institution, an empire declared by the Supreme Chancellor to the Senate in a speech of such calculated precision that the applause that followed it was genuine, because the people applauding had no way of knowing what had just been done in the temple and on 1,000 battlefields to make this moment possible. The Senate gave the applause that Palpatine had designed for them to give, which was a particular kind of applause, the applause of people who are relieved that someone capable is handling things they had become too frightened to handle themselves. The war had gone on for 3 years. The casualties had been enormous. The instability and the fear and the exhaustion of a galaxy that had never expected to fight at this scale for this long had worn people down to a point of genuine desperation, and Palpatine's empire arrived not as the imposition of tyranny, but as the promise of order. And the distinction between these two things is much harder to maintain in the living moment of fear than it appears in retrospect. Most of the senators who applauded did so because they believed the applause was warranted. This is the thing that is most difficult to hold about what Palpatine built. It was not built on the explicit consent of people who understood what they were consenting to. It was built on the genuine relief of people who wanted the suffering to stop, which is one of the most human of all desires, and which Palpatine had spent decades cultivating the conditions to fulfill. He gave them what they needed, and what they gave him in return was everything. Padme heard the speech. She was on Coruscant, carrying the weight of everything she knew and everything she suspected, and the growing weight of the twins inside her, and she heard Palpatine's voice announcing the end of the Republic and the dawn of the Empire. And she said, quietly, in the company of a small number of people she trusted, that this was how liberty died. She was right. She understood what was happening with the clarity of someone who had spent her adult life in politics, and who could read the shape of what Palpatine was doing, even if she could not yet see all of its dimensions. She went to Anakin. She went because she had to, because the gap between what she was hearing and what she knew about who Anakin was, and what she had believed about what they were together, had to be reconciled, had to be confronted, had to be given the chance to be something other than what it was beginning to look like from the outside. She found him on Mustafar, where Palpatine had sent him to finish the work of consolidating the Separatist elimination, to shut down the final piece of the war's machinery in the operation that had been designed to end the Separatist threat permanently. She had traveled there with Obi-Wan, following without her knowledge. And she arrived hoping to find the man she had married, rather than whatever the last several days had created. And, for a moment, when she first saw him, when he came toward her with the open relief of someone who has been carrying something alone and has just been given the chance to put it down, for that first moment she thought perhaps there was still a way through this, that the man she loved was still there, that the distance between what she feared and what was true might not be as great as she had begun to believe. And then he started talking, and the distance revealed itself. She found him there, and she told him what she had heard and what she feared. And she looked at him the way she had always looked at him when she needed to see what was really true about him. And what she saw frightened her more than anything she had encountered in a life that had contained a great deal of fear. He told her that what Palpatine was building was something they could lead together, that the Imperial system could bring order to the chaos that the Republic had become. He said these things in the voice of someone who had been telling himself the same things for long enough that they had begun to sound like conviction, and he reached for her in the way he always reached for her, when the distance between them felt like something he could not bear. But she stepped back, and then Obi-Wan was there, and the bridge between the person Anakin had been and what Anakin had become collapsed into ash and fire on Mustafar, and the lava ran underneath everything and above everything. There was only the heat and the sound of what cannot be. Undone. What the medical droid said afterward, when they examined Padme in the facility on Polis Massa, was that there was no medically identifiable cause for her decline. That physically, the birth had proceeded without serious complication. That the twins were healthy. That the mother was not. That she was alive but losing vitality without any organic reason that their instruments could identify. That she was fading in the way that sometimes happens when a person has sustained something that the body can survive, but that the self cannot. They said she had lost the will to live. And this answer has never fully satisfied anyone who has thought seriously about what happened. Because Padme Amidala was not someone who gave up easily, had never been someone who gave up easily, had spent her entire life fighting for things she believed in through circumstances that would have broken most people. The thought that she simply decided, on the night of the twins' birth, to stop, has always felt incomplete. There are those who have argued that Palpatine had a hand in it. And this argument is not as speculative as it first appears. Palpatine's knowledge of the dark side's capacity to affect life force was real. It was the same knowledge that he had used to construct the story of Darth Plagueis. The same tradition that had given Plagueis the ability to manipulate midichlorians, to create life, and theoretically to drain it. The timing of Padme's decline, happening in the same hours that Anakin's broken body was being rebuilt on Coruscant, suggests a connection that no one has ever been able to fully disprove. If Palpatine was drawing on her vitality to sustain the transformation of his new apprentice, it would explain what the medical droids could not. It would make her death not the incidental casualty of a broken heart, but the deliberate final act of a man who had used every other piece of this situation with such precision that an accidental cost in this particular place would be the only element that had not been designed. Whatever the mechanism, she died. She died with the twins beside her and the names she had chosen for them still fresh from her lips. She died in a facility far from Coruscant, far from the temple, far from the life she had built, with only a small number of people she trusted near her. She died before Anakin, on his operating table, could speak her name. She died while he was becoming Darth Vader. She died. And then the voice of Darth Vader asked where she was. He already knew. Some part of him already knew. The part that was still Anakin Skywalker, underneath everything that had been done to him and everything he had done to himself. The part that had loved her since he was 9 years old and had never fully released that love, no matter how much the Jedi had told him to, no matter how much the dark side had tried to reshape the man who carried it. That part already knew. And the sound he made when Palpatine told him was not the sound of a Sith Lord receiving information. It was the sound of a person who has done the worst thing imaginable in order to prevent a specific outcome, and who has just been told that the outcome happened anyway. He had done it all for her. He had crossed every line he had ever held, had broken every promise he had ever made to himself about who he would and would not become, had killed his brothers and sisters in the Order and stood at the door where the younglings gathered and done what he had done. And he had done it because the dream told him she was going to die, and he could not accept that, and she had died anyway. Not in spite of what he had done, because of what he had done. The visions he had seen were not a warning he had failed to prevent. They were a description of the path he was already on. The Force had shown him the consequence of his own choices, wearing the costume of inevitability. And he had looked at the costume and chosen the choices. This is where the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker reaches the place that defies easy summary. The place that makes it something more than simply a story about a man who chose the wrong thing. The choice was made in love. The love was real. The love remained real even inside everything that came after. Even inside Darth Vader. Even inside the suit and the breathing and the decades of terrible service to a man who had manipulated him into this shape. The love never went away. It went underground, as it had always gone underground when the external conditions made it impossible to hold openly. And it waited there in the dark for someone to find it. It waited for 23 years. It waited until a young man with the same eyes and the same stubbornness and the same absolute refusal to accept that the person he loved was beyond saving stood in front of him and called him by his true name. But that is later. That is another story for another time. Tonight, on Coruscant, in the operating theater where the machine finished the work of making Darth Vader, there was only the breathing. The new, mechanical, terrible breathing, and the question that had already been asked, in the voice that was already different, already filtered through the instrument that would carry it for the rest of its life. And Palpatine's answer, and the sound of something enormous breaking. Consider what the galaxy looked like in the days that followed. The Clone Wars ended. The Republic ended. The Jedi Order ended. The Senate continued to exist, but in a form so hollowed of its original purpose that the name was the only thing left that bore any resemblance to what it had been. 1 billion worlds came under the administration of an empire led by a man who had spent decades working toward exactly this outcome and who was now, for the first time in his enormously long life, precisely where he wanted to be. He was not satisfied by this in the way that most people imagine someone would be satisfied by the achievement of a lifetime's ambition. He was not at rest. He was simply ready to begin the next phase of a project that had no terminal point short of the heat death of meaning itself. He wanted everything. He had always wanted everything. He had simply been patient about the order in which he took it. And somewhere in the machinery of this new order, in a suit of black armor, walking the corridors of a galaxy that had just changed in ways most of its inhabitants had not yet understood, there was the remnant of Anakin Skywalker, carrying the weight of what he had done and what he had lost and what he had become. He was 22 years old. He would carry it for the rest of his life. He would carry it through campaigns and atrocities and the service of a master he had chosen and then been unable to unchose, through decades of enforcing the will of an empire he had helped create. Through everything the suit allowed him to feel and everything it prevented him from feeling. He would carry it all the way to a Death Star, 23 years later, where his son would call him by his true name, and something long buried would stir, and the boy from Tatooine would find his way back through all of it for one last moment before the Force took him. But the question that this story returns to, the question that everything you have heard tonight circles around and never fully answers, is whether any of it had to happen this way. Whether there was ever a version of that night in which Anakin Skywalker did not walk into Palpatine's office. Whether there was a version in which he stayed in the temple, as Mace Windu asked him to, and let the Jedi handle what the Jedi had gone to handle, and waited and trusted whether the outcome of that version would have been better or simply different, whether Mace Windu would have killed Palpatine in that office, or whether Palpatine had more in reserve than Mace's Varpad had yet found, and whether the story would have gone to a different dark place by a different road. There is no answer. The Force does not run backward. The past is not a variable in any equation available to the living. What happened is what happened. Mace Windu went to that office, and 3 masters died in seconds, and Mace himself came closer than anyone else in this period of history came to ending Palpatine. And Anakin Skywalker came through the door and made a choice in a fraction of a second that had been 30 seconds in the making, and 22 years in the preparation. The choice was made. The hand fell. The lightning came. And the galaxy became the galaxy it was. For the next 23 years, what can be said about the choice in the quiet that comes after? In the place where stories like this are meant to settle into something that can be rested with, is this. Anakin Skywalker was not a villain in the way that the stories of his time would eventually frame him. He was not simply seduced by power, or broken by ambition, or corrupted by hatred. He was a man who loved too hard and was given too little support for that love, who was told to release what he could not release and to let go of what he could not let go of, who found in Palpatine the one relationship in his life that never asked him to be less than he was, without understanding, until it was too late, that what Palpatine was giving him was not acceptance but cultivation. He was the boy from Tatooine who had once asked a stranger whether she was an angel, who had raced pods to win his freedom and left his mother behind, and spent 13 years trying to become what the Jedi wanted, and always falling short of the specific thing they were withholding. He was the husband who kept the most important relationship of his life a secret for 3 years, because the order he belonged to would have expelled him for having it. He was the man standing in the doorway of a chancellor's office, watching the only hope he had left for saving his wife about to be extinguished. He made the wrong choice. He knew it the moment he made it, or as close to the moment as the human capacity for self-knowledge allows. The look on his face after the lightsaber crossed the space was not the look of someone who had done what they intended. It was the look of someone who has seen themselves do something they had believed they would not do, and who has not yet found the story that makes it bearable. He would find versions of that story eventually, the way people always find stories that make unbearable things bearable, because the alternative is to stop functioning. But the original look, before the stories arrived, was the look of a person confronting the truest version of themselves and not recognizing what they saw. There is a way of telling the story of that night that makes it about power and betrayal and the corruption of a good man by a patient and malevolent evil. That version is not wrong. Palpatine was malevolent and patient, and his cultivation of Anakin across 13 years was one of the most precisely executed acts of corruption in the galaxy's recorded history. But that version leaves out the part that makes it worth telling and worth sitting with in the quiet. It leaves out the love. It leaves out the boy on Tatooine who saw an angel in a girl who would become his wife, and the vow he made over his mother's body, and the dream that came every night and showed him the worst thing he could imagine, and the door of the temple that no one held open for him when he needed to walk through it towards something other than what he found. It leaves out the unbearable, essential, ordinary human truth that the most devastating things that happen in the world do not usually happen because someone decided to be a monster. They happen because someone decided to love and found no good way to do it, and ran out of time, The Jedi Temple burned through the night. The signal went out across the galaxy. The clones turned on their generals one by one, on 1,000 worlds, and the Force absorbed the shock of 10,000 deaths before the dawn arrived anywhere. And, in the ruins of all of it, in the place where a 22-year-old man had made a half-second decision that changed the history of civilization, the thing that is hardest to hold and most important to hold is simply this: he did it because he loved her. That is not an excuse. It is not a justification. It is not a reason to diminish what followed or to look away from the weight of what was done. It is simply the truth, which has a particular kind of gravity that no other frame can replace. He did it because he loved her. And she died anyway. And somewhere in the breathing machinery of Darth Vader, for every year of the 23 that followed, that truth went on living, waiting, persistent as the Force itself, for the moment when someone would reach far enough through the darkness to find it. The galaxy is a long story. The Night of the Choice is one chapter. And even the darkest chapters, if you read far enough, do not end where they seem to end. The Force does not abandon the people it has touched, even the ones who have turned away from it, even the ones who have used it for the worst things imaginable. It waits. It is patient in a way that exceeds even Palpatine's patience. Patient in the way that only something without an ending can afford to be. It waited for Anakin Skywalker. For 23 years it waited, in the space between the breathing and the armor and the decades of terrible service, for the moment when a son's voice would reach far enough through the dark to find what was still living underneath. May the Force be with you, always.